Hello, and welcome to SitRep, a security podcast powered by Samdesk. African tech startups are seeing a massive surge in investment as big money keeps pouring in with no signs of slowing down. Providing security for these new and up-and-coming companies is not a simple task. My guest today is Dr. Darren Q, a professor and the executive director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I'm MJ Banias, and this is your Intel Report on security in the African tech sector.
I'm MJ Banias, and welcome to SitRep. On today's Intel Report, we are speaking with Dr. Darren Q. He is the Executive Director for the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Dr. Q, welcome to SitRep.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for this conversation. The last 5 years in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa, there's been a large chunk of investment in the technology sector there, predominantly in financial tech or fintech, as well as other sort of tech startups. Can we discuss why Africa is experiencing a bit of a financial boost when it comes to a tech boom, predominantly in Nigeria and Kenya, where it seems to be becoming a major industry?
For sure. And when you think of Nigeria and technology, I think many of your viewers will first of all think about the scam emails they've received from Nigerians over the years. And,
Nigeria, yeah.
Exactly. And it's a bit tongue in cheek, but actually in a funny way that shows how organic the boom has been across much of Africa, in the sense that, at least in the early stages of the tech boom, because the national networks, particularly in terms of the state phone service, the state power grid, and so on, were so dysfunctional around the late 90s, early 2000s period there, African entrepreneurs went whole heart into all of the new technologies that were happening. So I remember Lagos in the early 2000s at that point suddenly became this forest of towers that everybody was putting up these large scaffolding towers, atop which would be some sort of an internet connector there in order to connect to the rest of the world. And then as the technology improved, local entrepreneurs really took advantage of that very quickly. And around the world, with just the basic connectivity that you have, you can actually do quite a bit of business. So I think that entrepreneurs, and in general too, I think what supports this is, certainly in the case of Nigeria, I would throw Kenya into the mix, and South Africa and other parts of Africa as well. There's a tremendous entrepreneurial spirit. I think in part because the state has been so dysfunctional for so long, it's a deeply self-help culture all across the continent in many ways. And I think those factors combined for local entrepreneurs to really identify that the new technologies were a real gateway for financial success. And I think that has fed in the last decade or so to increasing investment in this area. And the other thing, I think, in the first democratic regime in Nigeria, the Obasanjo regime, after many years of military rule, one thing that they did, which was really smart economically, is they got out of the way of the telecom sector. And they regulated it very lightly and create a circumstance where cell phones across Nigeria just exploded. And the numbers between 2000 and 2010, if you see the number of folks that have it's incredible. And at some point around 2010, I remember reading that Nigerians were the fastest Facebook joiners at that time. So you'd walk into somebody's room and there'd be a couple of cell phones and there'd be a laptop open with Facebook open, and people would be engaging in all that kind of social media aspect. So the social media dimension has been a massive interest across the country. And it fits very much with, again, speaking very broadly, highly social cultures all across the continent. Family is huge. When you meet someone on the street, you have to greet them. People call you on a regular basis just to say hello. So all of that together, I think, combined for a really enabling environment for particularly communications technologies and the support that goes with that.
I wanted to jump into, as you mentioned, the towers that are popping up. I know a chief problem that every person I've spoken to about these, who kind of works in these startups, the chief problem that they always face is logistics. Is there enough electricity? Is there enough cell phone coverage? Is there enough roadway to transfer even products around if they're creating products, trucking routes, and how do you pay for those services? What are key logistics issues that security individuals, like experts in security, or just people who are investing in fintech startups in Nigeria or Kenya, what are the chief logistical issues they're going to face right out the door?
Some of the infrastructure, my understanding, is fairly well in place. So my understanding is that in terms of, for instance, internet coverage, that Nigerians have the global class internet connectivity all the way up to the provider company. From the company to the consumer is all across the board in terms of whether folks are able to get that high quality. And there are some companies that do it better than others. And there are a host of issues there. I think that, but you put your finger on it in terms of the electricity in particular being a really critical variable here. Nigerians have faced electricity problems for decades, and every successive government has promised to fix the problem, and every successive government has failed because electricity has just so many different stages to it. And there are so many different opportunities for corruption, such that there are some really powerful stakeholders that have a real interest in preventing that from happening. So I would say that we could expand that to say this is, I think, a general problem in Nigeria and Africa overall, is that you have some very powerful political players who have deep financial interests in the status. They are making a lot of money off of the dysfunctional nature of things. So, for instance, in terms of just getting fuel into the country, Nigeria is one of the world's largest oil exporters, but it imports a tremendous amount of refined fuel because there are powerful people that are making a lot of money from importing that fuel. So there's dimensions like that all through the system that play a key role.
It's not just Nigeria. I know, for example, South Africa even has significant strains on their energy infrastructure, on their electrical grid. I remember I was working with a reporter on another story concerning security cameras and how private operated security cameras were literally siphoning electricity from the public grid, and they wouldn't pay for their own line. They would just plug it into a public line and never pay for it. Kenya as well does have some similar issues concerning just coverage of electricity and occasional sort of brownouts or blackouts where there's no electricity being provided. So yeah, that definitely is a massive aspect. How about from like a labor perspective? I understand Nigeria's population, especially Kenya as well. It's like the vast majority of the population is very,
yes.
You have a lot of younger people. So let's dive into the actual security issues that people who would potentially work in this industry face.
Yeah, the demographics are stunning, actually, in terms of the numbers vary widely, but somewhere around 50 to 60% of Nigerians are under the age of 20 to 25. You have a massive sort of demographic shift coming up with huge numbers of young people who have grown up in an environment with poor economic prospects and poor education to help them find global alternatives there, which then creates a huge number of young unemployed men who are prime targets for fundamentalist groups, for separatist groups, for criminal gangs, all the sort of anti-stability activities that we're most afraid of. Before I get into that, let me just underscore something you said, though, as well, which is the massive poverty. Nigeria in particular, but most of the African countries have the top 5% living on a huge percentage of the wealth in the country, whereas the bottom 50% is living on $1 to $2 a day, depending on where you are in the country. It's massive folk at the bottom who are also a highly young population who are understandably disinclined to pay for anything. So we'll find any sort of option in order to connect to the sort of the energy grid and to the internet grid and so forth that we're talking about. And it has ballooned the corruption economies in all of these countries, which is then another problem for investors to think about. Is you have powerful individuals, and most of these countries essentially are oligarchy, where you have extremely powerful, very rich individuals at the top who do not respect the rules and in fact try to use the system for personal enrichment. And so that cascades down through their networks and all the way down to the bottom, where people say, nobody at the top is playing by the rules. Why should I do? And so you throw the youth bulge into this, where you have a massive number of young people who look into this and see that the only way they can really make it in life is to engage in anti-state behavior. And then if you throw in the ideology of various religious fundamentalist perspectives on this, then it becomes even more toxic. Or if you throw in separatist ideologies in other parts of the countries, all of these things are energizing for young people. And the other part of this, too, is the region is awash in small arms and larger arms as well since Gaddafi was overthrown. So it's created a huge market for what the Nigerians call banditry gang. But these are essentially a variety of kidnapping, cattle rustling groups that in many places outgun the police and in some cases the military.
This is interesting because if, for example, you have a large, let's say, tech startup running out of Lagos in Nigeria or Nairobi in Kenya, even parts of South Africa and Egypt, if your job is, let's say, corporate security, or your job involved in trying to keep your employees safer, or like, how do you? What are the hurdles you'd have to jump when the police force is outgunned by non-state actors?
And yeah, that job's going to get more and more difficult, I think, before it gets better. In Nigeria, we're waiting for an election next year that sees if it brings in a government that is actually interested in trying to do something about the problem. But to go to your question, I think that the vision that many of us who watch Nigeria pretty closely, I think, are looking more and more towards is there will be certain cities that are islands where the government will be fairly able to enforce some measure of security within the island. And in Abuja, most noticeably, Port Harcourt, Kano, a few others may possibly fit into that. And then the areas in between, which are contested areas between various banditry groups, fundamentalist groups, and government actors at different times of the day or year, depending on what's going on. However, increasingly, certainly these banditry gangs and to some extent some of the fundamentalist and separatist groups have also shown capacity to penetrate the bubble in Abuja and Lagos. So Abuja in particular, I think, is more vulnerable because of its location and proximity in the north. Lagos has been, just by dint of the fact that it is such a beast of a city, it's so huge, it's tremendously hard. On the one hand, these networks can certainly get a hold in there if they want to blow things up and things like that. But in terms of regular daily security concern, where most people, like in tech companies, just have to be afraid that their employees will be kidnapped and ransomed, is, I think, the biggest concern they have. That dimension, I think, will be a little bit easier to protect in Lagos under certain circumstances, because there are going to be certain neighborhoods where there's going to be high-tech focus, and there will be then a focus of security that will try to keep things fairly well protected. And I do think that Lagos will continue to be about as secure as it has been. Kidnapping has been a problem in Lagos for years in many ways, but security companies are managing it fairly well. And I think sort of those dimensions will be able to work for a while, unless things in the country get much, much, much worse. And I think we still got a few years before Lagos becomes as vulnerable as some other parts of the country have become.
I'm curious, as this continues, because we've just seen it grow. Like, there's no downslope here. It started about 6 or 7 years ago where these companies started, and we're just seeing every year more money being put into tech startups out of Africa. Do you see that there's this potential where you're going to have to start working with some of these non-state actors or some of these groups to bring them into the fold a bit in order to get your shipments to places on time, in order to ensure your truck drivers, every time they get stopped, they know that, oh yeah, these guys are paying us, so it's okay?
And that's exactly what's happening already. And I think the model here is the oil industry in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. In the 90s and into the 2000s, we saw the rise of local community militias who initially had strong self-determination goals and were rightly outraged that there was tons of money going onto the Niger Delta and the communities were not making anything from it. And they were shutting down the pipelines and they were blowing things up. And eventually the state offered an amnesty program in 2009 and essentially brought these groups onto the payroll. And the oil companies also provide them with money because they're providing security, quote. But in fact, it's really just the security they're providing is that they're agreeing not to attack the pipelines. I think that's exactly what you're going to see happening with a lot of the kidnapping gangs, a lot of the cattle rustling. It depends on which part of the country you're in. Essentially, these armed groups are going to be given a cut, mafia style, to provide sort of local security and to agree to not interrupt anything that's going on because they're getting a cut. So it's just going to increase the cost of doing business, but there will be at least a stability in terms of the development of steady relationships with these sorts of networks. I think the big question is going to be to what extent the state is going to try to engage or absorb these folks And again, we're going to wait to see what the next president next year does about that. I'd expect we'll see some sort of carrot and stick approach where they're going to go after the biggest gangs and then try to, or perhaps the opposite, buy off the biggest gangs and then go after the little ones, something along those lines. But I think absolutely that these groups are going to have to be brought into the state system at some point. The question is when the state's going to do it.
Do you have a lot of young people who are able to get a good education in the four of these countries, as well as obviously around the continent, but they go to school, they get computer science degrees, they learn coding, they basically learn how to work at a startup tech company to develop apps? Is there for them like a reason to stay, or is there a sort of diaspora where they leave? And does it make sense to stay, especially knowing that now I work at company X, we're a startup, we just got a sizable investment, whether it's $50,000 American or some companies have gotten $1 billion American in investment and they become unicorns, as we call them. What keeps them?
Yeah, I think what keeps them there is just the massive size of these markets. I think Africa is still a tremendous undertapped market. And if it can just get some of the basics that you mentioned earlier in terms of electricity and roads and some basic modicum of security, the entrepreneurial spirit across the continent, it's going to be unleashed in a way that could be massive. But those are big ifs to provide that sort of stability. So what is happening is I think the youngest and the brightest who can get international education are leaving and are probably only going to come back to visit for a long time. The folks who get better educated locally but are not rich enough to be able to leave are the ones who are really driving the local technology boom and are the sort of the real entrepreneurs that are driving this in so many ways. Although you do get many of the best educated do come back out of just loyalty and a desire to be home, who take the risk to come back and do this as well. And they're the ones that when they do get enough money are sending their kids to go to education abroad but keep coming back because they do have the local embedded networks and they are tapping into this potential. But that said, I think the security situation has gotten bad enough over the last couple of years is that many of the middle and upper middle class folks are trying to get out as much as they can. Many of them are doing if they have the finances, they're moving their family to Britain or to the United States, and they are going back and forth between Lagos and London and so on. Folks who are not in that sort of financial position are sometimes doing that jump between Ghana. So we haven't even mentioned Ghana. Ghana is this island of stability in West Africa that has much better institutional development, much better infrastructure support. I think the Nigerian diaspora definitely is a massive force in Accra. So then that's a lot of the sort of tech middle class is going there. And then the folks who can't go are just doing their best to try to make it with what they have. And they are creating these sorts of islands of stability and security as best they can in Lagos and its environment.
Coming from, let's say, security in North America to Africa, what are some things that just need to be on your mind versus having the job here?
I think one first thing to remember certainly is that this is true all around the world, but in Africa and in Nigeria especially, local relationships are everything. And just in terms of the basics of being able to do your job, you're going to need to know local networks, local individuals, because it's really the only way to get the information that you need to understand to provide a secure environment for your colleagues in the work that you do. And I think an important caveat to that is that as an international, you are by definition a target. And second, if you are a local Nigerian, Kenyan entrepreneur, you are the second level target. As soon as people know exactly what your finances may be, you're constantly a target. And that there are economic systems that have developed around kidnapping people in those circumstances is, I think, something that's really important to understand. And then I think the other important point to keep in mind too is that corruption is institutionalized in every institution around the continent in to different degrees and in different ways. And navigating that is going to be a big central part of your job. Certainly government payoffs is a part of that, or trying to figure out how to navigate those regular sorts of demands is going to be a big part of managing operations and trying to figure out how to do. But to keep in mind that goes through the trade union sector, it goes through civil society, it goes through traditional institutions, chieftaincies, all that sort of thing. So it's not to say that everyone is corrupt, but that there's a systemic dimension to it, and that bureaucracies are built upon it to some extent. So understanding how to navigate that's going to be a really important part of the job.
One last question before I let you go. This has been incredible, this conversation.
Thank you.
Is for the people of Nigeria, for the economy of Nigeria or the economy of Kenya, as well as Egypt and South Africa. South Africa's kind of in a different ballgame, I think. But let's say for the three kind of key countries that are enjoying this sort of heavy tech boom, as well as other nations within Africa who have it to some degree. Do you think this sort of startup tech economy is going to shift the balance for the economy of these countries to become wealthier, more stable nations?
No, I'm glad you asked that question, because at least we can end on a little bit of a happier note, in the sense that it's not all doom and gloom. And much, I would say that the tech boom across Africa has generally been a tremendously empowering vehicle across the continent, in the sense that it really gets hyper local. Anybody with a cell phone or a smartphone can engage in a lot of the basic economic activity in those areas that you can worldwide in so many ways. Somebody in Lagos with a good idea for an app can still develop it pretty well there in Lagos. And you have all sorts of entrepreneurs that are doing exactly that. So I do think, and because of the financial flows that you mentioned much earlier, it also provides a way for the average Nigerian to tap into global financial flows in a small way, if they have good ideas and they're able to build those relationships. So I think at the very base of the pyramid, the tech boom has been incredibly important for the well-being of many Africans and opening up all sorts of possible doors for that sort of empowerment. And from a social movement perspective, we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, increasing numbers of Occupy Wall Street style social movements. And they even called it Occupy Nigeria at different times, where you have young people in suits and ties with their smartphones filling the streets and protesting various massive corruption activities happening at different times. The latest one, called NSARS in Nigeria, was about a police unit called SARS that is particularly known for its brutality. And many Nigerians in Lagos and other parts of the country filled the streets to protest it. So the tech boom is definitely fueling a progressive, broad-based youth politics across the country, which I think is very positive, and over the long term could help to develop some of the institutions that Nigeria needs. However, as we know, this technology is also deeply useful to power holders and to governments. And the Nigerian government, taking a leaf from the Russians and the Chinese, has tried at different times to try to impose certain controls on the internet, on technologies, in order to try to prevent scrutiny of the corruption of government and to prevent any sort of scrutiny of just public actors in general. Nigerian politicians have been less capable of doing that because it is a semi-democratic system, and progressive forces have been able to block those activities to some extent so far. But I think that sort of pressure is going to continue. And also, too, I just think that the banditry networks, the corruption networks, the mafioso style operations are also just going to get better at taking advantage of these sorts of things and learning how to steal money from people through all the various technologies we've talked about. And Nigeria is not going to have the kind of policing forces available to it to try to rein these in. So I do expect, so far as we see global technology-based gangs and robbery and global corruption networks, essentially, I would expect to see increasing numbers of them having important outlets, if not bases, in Nigeria over time. And I think we're going to have to see whether those are going to be able to be blocked out and resisted by global force, because the Nigerian government itself is not going to be in place to be able to do it.
So negatives and positives all the time. It always comes back to that. With every kind of good merit, there's always a flaw that's going to pop up. Dr. Q, can you please tell our audience, if they want to learn more about the work you do at the University of Massachusetts, if they're interested in conflict resolution or they're interested in security in Africa, where they can find your work, your social media? Plug yourself.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. And I'd be very happy to talk with any of your listeners. And I'm grateful for their interest as well. You can reach me by email, which is at darren.q, which is KEW, at umb.edu. And our website is peace, as in peace and justice, peace.umb, as in UMassBoston.edu. And we have material there. And I'm also available on Twitter if you just look my name up.
I will definitely put that all in the show notes for everybody who's listening. Dr. Q, thank you so much. This has been an honor, and thanks for appearing on SitRep.
Thank you. It's been an honor for me as well, MJ. Thank you.
That's all for this week's Intel Report. You can get in touch with the show at sitrep@samdesk.io. Make sure to click subscribe to stay on top of all of our episodes, including our expert interviews and our in-depth analyses of the events shaping your world. For more, follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn by searching for @samdesk or by visiting us at samdesk.io. Thank you for listening. See you back here next week.